Okay, so we are back here for exercise 23, which is the urinary system. And this is a diagram, or I'm sorry, a model of a plastination model that we have of the kidneys. So it's actually a real cadaver model. What they did was they shot this liquid polymer through the blood vessels of the kidneys. So you could see how extremely vascular the kidneys are. And that tells you a little bit about what the function of the kidneys are. And again, the kidneys here are these bean-shaped organs here. And they're really the vital organ for the urinary system. So what do the kidneys do? Why are they so vascular? They are one of our main excretory filters for the blood. And so they, again, are going to excrete wastes and water in the process of forming urine, okay? And that urine is how we get rid of that waste. So again, the kidneys are these main organs of the urinary system, and they're just amazing to me when you look at how vascular they are here. And the kidneys, these tiny bean-shaped organs, right, can actually filter approximately 50 gallons of fluid from the bloodstream every day. So the kidneys are going to be removing in this process of filtration. They're going to remove metabolic waste. They're going to remove extra ions. They're going to remove excess water and toxins from the blood in the process of forming urine. And they excrete those in the urine. So again, they'll also help to return needed substances, especially, again, some certain ions like sodium as well as water to the blood that are needed as well. So not only do they excrete, but they're also very efficient in terms of reabsorbing things that are needed for the body back into the blood, especially water and sodium ions, things like that. So again, kidneys also have again, some other functions. We talk about it a little more in lecture. We'll talk about how they regulate blood pressure, how they're involved with blood pH, how they're involved with red blood cell production via erythropoietin. So again, we'll get into that in lecture, so I'm not going to get into that here. I'm mainly going to try to focus on the anatomy and talk a little bit about some of I can't not talk about the physiology as we go through the actual anatomy here. So again, remember this organ is so vital for our survival that a loss of both kidneys would require some type of medical intervention, particularly dialysis. So again, that's one of the reasons that we spend so much time going into the details of the urinary system and especially the kidneys because they're such a vital organ to the human body. When we talk about the four organs of the urinary system, we're going to talk obviously a lot about the kidneys. So here are your two bean-shaped kidneys. We'll go into the details on your kidneys here in just a minute. And then we'll talk about the ureters, which are going to connect the kidneys to the bladder. And then this here is the urinary bladder. And then here you can't see it, but you would have the urethra, which would, again, expel the urine from the bladder, which stores the urine out to the outside world. So or what we say, the exterior. So again, the kidneys here are the organ that makes the urine. Their main function is the formation of urine. And then the three organs that are going to convey the urine to the exterior are the ureters here, the paired ureters, the urinary bladder, and then the urethra, which isn't shown here. Okay. So just to kind of give you a little overview of the urinary system as a whole. So now we're going to talk specifically about the kidneys. I'm going to follow your lab book as much as I can here. And we're going to go specifically into the actual kidneys. So the kidneys, again, are these bean-shaped organs, right? And it's paired. Obviously, you have two of them. They are in the abdominopelvic cavity, and they're what we call, this is very important to remember, that they are retroperitoneal. So these guys are actually behind the peritoneum. And the reason that's important to know is that if for some reason when you get a blow to the back right around the level of the kidneys, and just so you know, the level of the kidneys are about located at the level of your waist. They're usually in between the 12th thoracic vertebra and the 3rd lumbar vertebra. So that's where your kidneys run. So if someone were to take a hard hit in that area, they could potentially actually bruise their kidneys and damage their kidneys. And the reason being is that these guys are retroperitoneal. They don't have the protection of the peritoneal cavity, the mesentery, all that fat that's usually on the mesentery as well. They lack that protection. So if you're in emergency medicine, someone takes a blow to the back, that is something that you have to consider, is that they could potentially have bruised their kidneys, and that can be, again, a more life-threatening issue if they've damaged both their kidneys. So something just interesting to keep in mind. And that's why it's important to understand, you might wonder, why do we always emphasize their retroperitoneal? And that's the reason why. They just have less protection. They don't have that protection of the peritoneal cavity. Okay, so when we talk about the kidneys, they have this concave side on the medial surface of the kidneys, and we call this area the renal hilus. So here again would be the renal hilus right here, this little concave area. And this is where, in the renal hilus, the ureter, the renal artery, the renal vein, the lymphatics, the nerves are all going to enter and exit the kidneys here. Okay, so you can see again, here's your renal artery, your renal vein, here's your ureter right here. Okay, they don't show the lymphatics and nerves here, but all of those are entering and exiting the kidneys at what's called the renal hilus. Okay. So now let's dive into the internal anatomy of the kidney. Again, the kidneys, which I just find fascinating. I hope you guys find them as fascinating as I do. So when we get into the internal anatomy, you can divide the kidneys up into these 3 main regions that we'll go into in detail. So the first region is called the renal cortex. Oops, and I do have on the next slide over, I'm not going to use this as I go through it. I know it helps to give you some of the verbiage, but you can look at this afterwards, but it's just so busy. So I'm going to go over the anatomy on this slide here, but just know that when I post this for you, you do have this slide as well to help you locate some of these items. But so again, we have the internal anatomy, again, of the kidney divided up into 3 major parts. The renal cortex, which is, where's my arrow there? Here. This is the renal cortex. Then you have the renal medulla. So here's all of the renal medulla with these pyramid-looking structures or triangular-looking structures. That's all the renal pyramid. And then, renal medulla. There are renal pyramids. These will go into them. But this is all renal medulla here. All of this is renal medulla. And then you have what's called the renal pelvis. Okay, and so here's the renal pelvis. So again, to go back into each of these individual parts, the renal cortex is, again, this outermost kind of granular looking, especially if you're looking at an actual kidney, outermost kind of granular looking layer. So here it is. And just inside of the renal cortex here is going to be the renal medulla. So this is all renal medulla here. And the renal medulla is going to be really kind of striated as they kind of drew it in here. And that's because this is where all of your tubules of your nephrons and all the ducts of your coming off of the nephrons are going to extend through into the medulla. So you can kind of see they drew that here a little bit so that you can see, up in the cortex, and you'll see this, and we're going to get into the details on this a little bit, but you'll get to see this a little bit more in the cortex. As we go into the nephrons, you'll see that this portion of the nephron, especially the glomerulus and then the proximal convoluted tubule, I'll go into these in just a minute here, are going to be in the cortex. So, and then as you dive into the medulla, you're going to get into your tubule, your rest of your tubules, the loop of Henle, then the distal convoluted tubule comes back up into the cortex, and then you get into the collecting duct, which runs back down through the medulla. So you can kind of see all those different parts, but that's why you have this really striated looking medulla. Those striations are all of these tubules that are running through there. And really the urine, let me go back up here. So really, again, urine is going to be the process of the formation of the urine is going to happen in the cortex and the medulla here. Okay, so that's where urine formation is going to happen. And then in terms of the renal medulla, some anatomy that you should know for the renal medulla are these renal pyramids. There are these triangular looking structures. Here's a renal pyramid, here's a renal pyramid. And these are really going to be, again, where most of your tubules are running through, and eventually you'll see the collecting duct will dump into this portion here called the minor calyx and then into the major calyx. Then we also have what's called the renal columns. And the renal columns are these granular areas in between the pyramids here. And so you'll see again there, this will be where blood vessels, nerves, things will run through. So that's, and we're going to look into this in just a minute. When we get into the nephron, we'll go into the kind of a close-up of the cortex and the medulla here. So then at the very end of your renal pyramids here, you're going to see the renal pyramids end in this little structure at the very tip here called the renal papilla. So here's the renal papilla. Here's a renal papilla from kind of, that's the very tip. The renal pyramid would be behind it. And here you can see they tried to do that here as well. Here, right here. This one actually shows a nice one. This would be the renal papilla right here. And the renal papilla is where your renal pyramids are going to empty into the renal pelvis. So what is happening here is when we talk about the production of urine in terms of in the nephrons, you're going to see it ends with the collecting ducts. And the collecting ducts are all going to be running down here, okay, to this renal papilla. And then they're emptying into the renal pelvis through this minor calyx here, okay? So kind of cool to see all of this. I hope this helps to pull all the pieces together here. So again, as you go into, so the renal papilla is kind of the end of the production for urine. Then we dump into, okay, the renal pelvis through what's called the minor calyx. So here is a minor calyx. So the renal papilla is dumping into the minor calyx. Here is a minor calyx. And then those minor calyx that are going to collect urine here off of the renal papilla are then going to dump into the major calyx. Okay, and then the major calyx is going to dump into the actual renal pelvis here. And then the renal pelvis is going to convey that urine to the ureter, which will then move down the ureter, carries that urine all the way down to the urinary bladder. So when you look here, there are usually anywhere from 8 to 20 of these minor calyces that will drain. 8 to 20 of these minor calyces will drain into just 2 to 3 of the major calyces. And calyce is the plural for calyx, just in case you're wondering. So, and then those, again, 2 or 3, these 2 or 3 major calyces will then dump into the renal pelvis and then into the ureter. So this is the renal pelvis here. Number 4 would be the renal pelvis here. And then into the ureter is number 3. Okay, so hopefully that helps you in terms of your identification for some of the major parts to the kidneys. In terms of for the lab, I know we get into the circulation of blood through the kidneys a little bit in more detail in lecture, but for the lab, you just need to really be responsible for the renal artery. here, and then the renal vein coming out here. Okay, so those are the two that you really need to be responsible for: renal artery, renal vein. And then again, you can see the ureter here. Okay, let's see. Let me go through. I think next I wanted to go into the nephrons. So let's now get into the microanatomy and talk really about how urine formation is going to happen, okay? And the nephron, okay, which is what they're showing. I love this model because they actually show this in terms of where these nephrons would be in the kidneys. So the nephron is actually the functional subunit of the kidney. And this is the site of urine formation. This is where the magic happens, right? And when you talk about in the kidneys, there's about 1 million nephrons in each kidney. So again, major portion of the kidney in terms of formation of the urine. So here you can see here's a nephron dumping into the collecting duct, and then down into down through the renal pyramid, into the renal papilla, dump that urine through the renal papilla, into the minor calyx, into the major calyx, and then into the renal pelvis, and then into the ureter. So if flow charts help you, you might write that out. So that helps you out with where urine is going to flow. Okay. So let's get into the nitty-gritties on the nephron. So again, I love this diagram here because it shows where everything is in proportion to here showing you this is the cortex, the renal cortex, and here is the renal medulla. So let's get into, excuse me while I take a quick drink of water here. The nitty-gritties on the nephron. So when you look at the nephron, we're going to break it up into its two major parts. We'll have the renal corpuscle. So this is the renal corpuscle here. Here, this whole thing is the renal corpuscle. And then the second major part is the renal tubules. So again, all of these tubules, okay? So let's talk about the renal corpuscle first. Renal corpuscle is really the first step in terms of urine formation. So this is where we're going to be filtering initially the blood to form the initial filtrate in the kidneys, okay? And that's going to go into the tubules. So again, this is going to be located in the renal cortex, so you can see that here. And it's going to contain, when you talk about the parts of the renal corpuscle, and this is where a lot of students get confused. So the renal corpuscle is going to include the glomerulus, okay? And the glomerulus is this capillary network. This is the glomerulus, okay? And it's going to include what's called glomerular capsule or Bowman's capsule. This right here. This is I will call it the Bowman's capsule because I'm old school, but you can use either term, glomerular capsule or Bowman's capsule. I just like to give, those initial scientists who involved with the discoveries a little credit for all their hard work. So I will call it the Bowman's capsule. Again, you can use either term, glomerular capsule or Bowman's capsule. So again, this actually shows in red here. You can see the glomerulus, and then in white is the glomerular capsule. And so what happens here, and I talk about this again in terms of lecture, is you have this afferent arteriole, and you'll always know the afferent arteriole is going to be larger in diameter, okay? And then the efferent arteriole coming out is going to be more narrow in diameter. So that's how you can identify when you're looking at this model. So this is the afferent, 6 is the afferent, and afferent is coming in, okay, bringing the blood into the glomerulus here. And then here is the efferent carrying blood away, or you can always think of exit. It's exiting the glomerulus, okay? So, and you can picture this being a little bit like the nozzle on a hose, right? And so here you've got the wider portion of the hose is the afferent arteriole. And here is the more narrow portion. If you had like if you put a nozzle on your hose to really kind of increase the force or pressure of that water coming out of the hose, you would put a nozzle with a more narrow opening. And that's what's happened here. You have a wider opening here and a more narrow opening here in the efferent arteriole. And so what this does is this creates pressure, right, inside these capillaries. And that's what we call the glomerular blood hydrostatic pressure, okay? And so what happens is, again, just like the nozzle of the hose, right, it really increases the pressure in these capillaries of the glomerulus. And that helps to force and push blood up against those glomerular walls, pushing out water and some of those soluble materials like ions, okay, out into this capsular space right here. So the capsular space is a space in between the glomerulus and the Bowman's capsule here, okay, especially the outer wall, I should say, of the Bowman's capsule, okay. So, and what happens is as that happens, okay, as that glomerular blood hydrostatic pressure, and we get it more into detail on the pressures that are involved. We'd also talk about blood osmotic pressure and capsular hydrostatic pressure, and we talk about how that results in the net filtration rate, right? So the net filtration rate is going to equal the glomerular blood hydrostatic pressure minus the blood. So that glomerular blood hydrostatic pressure is pushing the fluid out of the glomerulus. And then we have these two littler pressures, the capsular hydrostatic pressure as well as the blood osmotic pressure, kind of pulling things back into the glomerulus, okay? But the net result of those two is the net filtration rate. And that there is what's going to result in the initial formation of the filtrate here, okay? So now, whatever was pushed out here out of the glomerulus and not reabsorbed is your initial filtrate in that capsular space, okay? And so now, from here, the filtrate can then enter the renal tubules, okay? So from here, it's going to enter the three segments of the renal tubules. First, the proximal convoluted tubule. So here you can see this is the proximal convoluted tubule right here. And then we go into the lovely loop of Henle. So here is the loop of Henle, starting with the descending limb of the loop of Henle and then up the ascending limb. And then we go into the distal convoluted tubule here. And then that's the end of our renal tubules. We end in the collecting duct. So it's important to know all these parts, and for lecture, it's more important to know what they do. I'll talk a little bit about what they do here just in terms of helping tie in lecture and lab. But for the most part, oh, really quick, I forgot to mention something. There is an error on the key on page 279, and this is a really important error. For some reason, it's mismarked. And so if you look at that key, it says that 2.1 is the afferent arteriole. It is not. It is the efferent arteriole with an E. So efferent arteriole for 2.1. Just really quick so that gets clarified. There is an error on that key on page 279. Okay, so let me go back here. And we are now on to the renal tubules. Okay, so the first tubule, okay, coming again off of the capsular space as the filtrate moves down here, is the proximal convoluted tubule. And you can see it's convoluted, hence the name convoluted tubule. So, but it's most proximal, so we call it to the glomerulus. So it's the proximal convoluted tubule. And the proximal convoluted tubule, again, is mostly in the renal cortex, but it's going to descend here into the medulla. okay, where the filtrate is going to enter the loop of Henle. And so the proximal convoluted tubules are actually quite important because this is the primary site here for reabsorption. This is where water and solutes are going to move from the filtrate back into the interstitial fluid and then back into the surrounding nearby peritubular capillaries, okay? So this is really important, and so important that about 100% of most of the organic solutes, like especially glucose, 65% of water and sodium ions are actually going to be returned back to the blood here in the proximal convoluted tubules. So the proximal convoluted tubules are a main primary site for reabsorption. So again, an important part of the renal tubules, okay? The second part of the renal tubules is going to be the loop of Henle, okay? And we're going to break up the loop of Henle into the two parts, the descending limb of the loop of Henle and the ascending limb of the loop of Henle. And again, I'm just going to talk about this briefly because I really go into lecture on the countercurrent flow that occurs here in the loop of Henle. So it's very important that you watch the videos on that and get a really good grasp and understanding of that, because that tells you how reabsorption is so efficient. And that countercurrent flow is just so cool, guys. I mean, to me, that's where the human body is just so amazing because it's so incredibly efficient. So please, I don't have time to get into that in the lab video, but please, 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 when you're going through the lecture, make sure that you watch the animations on that because it'll just blow your mind. So again, here in the descending limb of the loop of Henle, this is where water from the filtrate will be reabsorbed, okay? However, it's important to remember for lecture again that descending limb is going to be impermeable to solutes. So solutes cannot move across it, just water, okay? Only water moves across here. And that's where we get about 15% of the water reabsorption here. So what's cool, guys, is when you talk about, I'm going to try to tie this into lecture here just real briefly. If you haven't watched the lecture, you might have to come back. But you get 65% of your water reabsorption in the proximal convoluted tubule here, and then about 15% in the descending limb of the loop of Henle, okay? So that gives you a total of 80%, and that 80% is what we call your obligatory water reabsorption, okay? So it's obligatory. It's obliged to happen. That's, going to happen just from the sheer anatomy of the kidneys, okay? The other 20% of the water reabsorption is going to be subject to hormonal control in especially the distal tubules. And that's what we call the facultative reabsorption, okay? So that's going to be due to things like antidiuretic hormone, aldosterone, things like that. So again, I just wanted to tie that back in really quick, and I hope that helps if you've watched the lecture already. Okay, so again, a descending limb of loop of Henle here is going to, again, be permeable to water, okay? And then the ascending limb of the loop of Henle is now going to be permeable to sodium and chloride, but not to water. And again, so this is where we would get in the ascending limb here of the loop of Henle. Where's my arrow? The ascending limb here is where we're going to get reabsorption of solutes. And so again, it's very important to understand this for the countercurrent flow, and that countercurrent flow, again, is a way in which we can maximize reabsorption. So again, we get water reabsorption in the descending limb of the loop of Henle. The ascending limb of the loop of Henle is just reabsorption of sodium and chloride, okay, primarily. All right, so then we move from the ascending limb, okay, again, ascending because it's moving up, ascending limb into the distal convoluted tubule. So again, it's also convoluted here, easy to remember, and it's distal from the glomerulus, so hence the name distal convoluted tubule. And the distal convoluted tubule moves back up into the renal cortex. And here in the distal convoluted tubule, we get some small amounts of reabsorption of water and solutes. But the primary function, the main function of the distal convoluted tubule here is going to be for secretion. So getting that secretion of excess ions that are going to be transported from the blood. So from the blood here, these blood capillaries, the paratubular capillaries, into the interstitial fluid and then into the renal tubule. Okay, so we call that secretion to get rid of those excess ions. Okay, so from the blood into the interstitial space and into the distal convoluted tubule. Okay, and that helps us just to get rid of, secrete some of that excess water and solutes that might be left in the surrounding tissue. Okay, and so from there, we're going to move from the distal convoluted tubule into this collecting duct. Okay, and the collecting duct is now going to drain filtrate the urine into through the renal pyramid, right, into the renal papilla, and then down into the minor calyx, major calyx, and renal pelvis. Okay, so what's important to remember about this distal convoluted tubule is that this is where you have the receptors for antidiuretic hormone, right? And antidiuretic hormone, remember, increases reabsorption of water to produce kind of a more concentrated urine. This is the one where alcohol, remember, inhibits the release of antidiuretic hormone. So you inhibit that reabsorption of the water, which is why you have a less concentrated urine and you have to urinate more if you're drinking alcohol. So also you have receptors. So you have receptors here for antidiuretic hormone. The cells here also have, we're going to respond to aldosterone, which causes the sodium reabsorption and potassium secretion that we talk about in lecture. So again, I'm just trying to tie some of that lecture in. I know that makes this a little longer, but hopefully you get it twice and it really helps you I feel like, see it alongside the function there. So again, collecting ducts are going to, let's see, where do we go back up here? Collecting ducts here are going to dump again that filtrate now into the renal papilla here. From the renal papilla, we go into the minor calyx, then into the major calyx here, then into the renal pelvis, and then finally into the ureter. Okay. So hopefully that helps you out a little bit. We talk a little bit more about the paratubular capillaries here. I talked a little bit about them. And then the vasa recta here in lecture. So I'm not going to get into them here, but you can see here is the vasa recta, and then here's some of the paratubular capillaries. Just because I know I get too wordy here. So I do help, please give me feedback. I do hope that some of the, giving you some of the functions here will really help kind of instill this in lecture. But you're welcome, please give me feedback. This is the first semester that I've done these videos. So now let's talk about, okay, the kind of some of the macro anatomy. So now we're going to go back to the organs. So remember we talked about kidneys were the organ in terms of their function was the formation of urine. Then we now have the channeling urine, the organs that are involved with channeling urine to the exterior. And that's going to be the ureters here, the urinary bladder, and then the urethra here, which we can see the urethra here. Okay, so let's talk about the ureters real quick. The ureters, again, the renal pelvis is going to dump the urine or filtrate into the ureters, okay, which we now can call urine. And the ureters are these narrow tubes that are going to, again, channel urine from the kidneys down to the urinary bladder. They are also retroperitoneal. They're about 1 to 2 millimeters in diameter. So again, not that wide, right? And that's important to remember in terms of things like kidney stones. They do have a muscularis layer that we talked about in the lecture that consists of smooth muscle, and that helps in terms of providing peristaltic contractions to bring that urine all the way down to the urinary bladder. When we get into the urinary bladder is going to collect and store urine temporarily here. And just kind of as a reminder from way back in the very beginning of the semester, remember that the interior of the urinary bladder consists of transitional epithelium, and that transitional epithelium, remember, is very important in terms of allowing for stretch. Also, you can see here that you have rugae, which are those folds, kind of like the stomach had the rugae. Here we have rugae folds in the urinary bladder, and that also allows for more stretch in the urinary bladder. We also have in the urinary bladder here what's called the detrusor muscle. And so they don't depict it all that well here, but here would be the detrusor muscle on the outside here. And that detrusor muscle helps to contract and expel urine, okay, out of the bladder. So then let's look at one of the structures that you're supposed to know for the urinary bladder called the trigon. So here is the trigon, and it's these three openings. So here, 1, 2, 3, and this forms basically kind of a triangle, right? So hence the trigon here. Here we go. And so what it consists of is these two ureteral openings. So ureteral. The ureters come in here, and so it's ureteral orifices here, and so those are the openings where the ureters come in. And then you have, and so those are kind of on the posterior side. Then more anterior, you're going to have the urethral orifice. So again, the ureters come in here, and then here is you have the urethral orifice here, and that forms the trigon, those three openings. Then you have exiting the bladder here, and you'll see at the very end of the bladder here, we'll talk about, we do have a sphincter here, okay, and that sphincter is going to help in terms of the release of urine into what's called the urethra. So the urethra is the next, the last organ that you have to know that's going to bring urine from the urinary bladder to the exterior. And so this is the process. When we carry urine from the bladder to the exterior, we call this process micturition. It's also called voiding, but usually in a more medical setting, we use the term micturition. And just as a kind of funny side story, you can get something called micturition syncope, so it's important to know the term micturition. It actually happened to my husband. He probably hates that I'm going to tell the story, but he actually was traveling, and he got up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom and passed out, woke up in his own blood because he had fallen and hit his head and had no idea what happened. And so they took him to the hospital, and they ran all these tests on him, and what they found out is that he is subject to something called micturition syncope, which can happen to men in the evening if they get up and urinate. The process of micturition can cause a rapid decrease of blood pressure and cause someone to pass out, which is syncope. So kind of interesting micturition syncope, fun story for you there. But anyway, so that's the process again of voiding and releasing that urine from the bladder into the urethra. So you have what's called an internal urethral sphincter, and that internal urethral sphincter is going to be this smooth muscle, and I don't believe they show it here, but you would have a layer of smooth muscle that runs encircles the urethra here, right around this urethral orifice here, and it is involuntary, okay? So it's going to be smooth muscle, and it must relax for the urine to flow outward, okay? And then, of course, we have one that's under our control here called the external urethral sphincter, which would be, again, farther down here. And the external urethral sphincter is usually embedded in the kind of urogenital diaphragm. So again, you won't see that here. But that's the one that's under voluntary control. So it consists of skeletal muscle. And that's the one that's going to permit, that's the one that we have control over in terms of permitting the flow of urine out. Okay, so really quick, the urethra that we show here obviously is just a small portion of the urethra in the male. And so just a little kind of interesting fact again, the urethra is an example of what we call sexual dimorphism, meaning it's different in the male versus the female. The female urethra is much shorter, obviously, because it doesn't have to travel through the penis. So the female urethra is only about 4 centimeters, where when you're talking about the male urethra, it's about 15 to 20 centimeters long, so much longer. Again, that's because it runs through the penis. And we'll talk about the different, and especially more in the reproductive system, we talk about the different parts of the urethra, especially the prostatic urethra, the membranous urethra, and then the spongier penile urethra. So we'll talk about those coming up later on here. So that's it for this portion of it. I am going to do a separate, quick, very short video on urinalysis, which will be the lab exercise 24, and I will actually demonstrate the urinalysis with one of the sticks for you. So always exciting when I get to show you my, my urine, who doesn't want to see that, right? So anyway, that will be the next video. So I hope this is helpful, and have a good night.